Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I am Natalia Humaniuk. Tonight on the Sunday show. US and Russia clash over Syria. What does it mean for the region? A critical look at reforms in Ukraine. How should Ukraine tackle its corruption? We talk to one of the most outstanding anti-corruption activists in Eastern Europe. Who are the foreigners who came to observe the illegal elections in Crimea? How Donbas and Georgia demined their conflict zones. It was a threat that the United States followed through on. On April 13, the US, together with its allies France and the United Kingdom, launched airstrikes on Syrian chemical weapon facilities in response of the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. The move has been supported later by Germany, though Russia claims that the attack will exacerbate the humanitarian catastrophe on Syria. What we also know from US military officials is that the military advised Russia on airspace that would be used in the strike, but didn't pre-notify them of that. The situation is unfolding, and at this stage we would like to discuss not that much details of the attack and the military actions, but what it all means for further US-Russia relations and the relations between President Trump and his European counterparts, as well what impact it may have on this part of the world. And we are happy to have here Jeffrey Gedmin, Senior Fellow at Georgetown University and analyst on Russia as well the Benjamin Haddad, who is the Fellow at Hudson Institute and is a key expert on US-France elections. And we are happy to have you both. You're always based in Washington, D.C. and now in Kyiv. So probably just to start, what would you say on the, Jeff, maybe you would start on there were expectations that probably there would be the strike, but really what it all means in general for geopolitics and what to expect.
Well, I'm happy to start, and I don't think we know, for a number of reasons, because it's early, because we have an American president who is early in his administration, 14 months or so, because we have an American president who has been exceptionally, let's say, volatile and unpredictable in any utterance having to do with Russia. And I would say what I'm keenly interested in, by the way, if this was a retaliatory punitive strike that could possibly affect the behavior of a barbaric criminal regime, I applaud that. I'm equally and probably more interested in whether this emerges as an element of a strategy on Syria that's serious and sustainable. And I don't know if it is or not. We don't know if it is or not.
Ben, you actually had written recently a piece that France has to support the attacks in the response of the chemical weapon use. So what you would say?
Yeah, well, I agree with Jeff. I mean, first, I think that it was very important for the United States and Europeans to react together to this use of chemical weapons against civilians by the Syrian regime, because we had set a red line. And you remember that the Obama administration had set that same red line against the use of chemical weapons, but did not act upon it in September 2013. And it sent, I think, a message of weakness, a message of lack of determination to the Syrian regime, to its backers in Iran and Russia, and I think it reverberated around the world. I think when Russia decided to intervene in Ukraine, for example, they remembered that the Obama administration did not act on its own red line. So I think first it was a very important message to send to our adversaries, and it was important to increase the cost to the Assad regime. I agree with Jeff. It's not clear today if it's in a broader strategy in Syria, if the administration wants to take further steps, maybe to fight against Assad, isolate him, and fight against his backers. But I think it's a good first step. And the second thing I would say, to come back to your question on the geopolitics of this, is that it is a further step in the confrontation between the United States and Russia. And it's particularly interesting because this is a president, Donald Trump, who, as you know, was elected with a very pro-Putin message. You know, during his campaign, he said, why can't we get along with Russia? We need to cooperate on Ukraine and Syria. And what you've seen over the last few months is that this cooperation does not exist. It's not working. And on the contrary, the administration has taken steps to send javelins to Ukraine, to implement new sanctions, to expel Russian diplomats after the Skripal assassination attempt in the UK. So this is a new step, I think, in the realization from Donald Trump and his administration that you need to confront Russian aggression.
And Jeff, to what extent really you have this, you know, how would you describe this today's relations between the President Trump and the Russian President Putin? Because of course a lot of people see particularly those strikes as probably the sign that indeed there is a confrontation, there are the sanctions. Though there are the people who would say, in fact, it could be different. It's not just that much about president. It could be not systematic. So really, how you would explain currently these relations?
Well, it's the difficulty with life so often. Two things can be true at the same time. So we've seen the application of tough sanctions, and now we've seen some toughness and military action in Syria. And that's true. And that's a different face for Donald Trump, and it's a tough hand vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin. We've also seen the face of fondness, of affection, and even admiration for the Russian president, for whatever reasons. It seems a little bit complicated and bewildering to me. We also, I think, want to note that while the president is the commander-in-chief, and that's vitally centrally important, no administration is a monolith. And we have now a new national security advisor. We have now incoming a new secretary of state. They won't define everything, but they will endeavor to shape the view of the United States and the views of the president to some extent. So I would say it's too early to tell whether now this is the emergence of Donald Trump hawk vis-a Russia, or whether this is a momentary interlude, but something is changing, something is moving in some way, I think.
But also, what impact it would have on Syria. We can say that it's too early to say, but in generally we see that the Assad regime is in fact pretty stable, and what's happening within the last year is not really that it's not winning. It looks like the Syrian regime is becoming more and more stable in Syria.
Yeah, I agree, and we've wasted so much time because since 2011 we've said Assad must go, we set a red line on the use of chemical weapons, and at the same time there's been so little European and American reaction to the massacre in Syria. And I think, probably in the United States people were wary of what had happened in Iraq, and and Barack Obama was elected in 2008 on a program of withdrawal from the Middle East. Same thing, Donald Trump also was elected on a very isolationist platform. So I think there was not a lot of political appetite to get more involved in Syria, but we've wasted so much time. And Iran got more involved, especially through its proxies like Hezbollah. Russia got directly involved in 2015 and managed to change the balance of force in favor of Assad. I think these strikes are important. Once again, they're a first step. They're an important message of credibility, especially after we said that we would intervene if chemical weapons were used. Are they going to change the situation in itself in Syria? Of course not. So the question now is it only a one shot and we send a message, or is it part of a broader strategy? I do think we should get more involved. I do think there's a lot we can do, including non-militarily. We could isolate Assad financially. You still have some of his backers that have money in London and in Europe. We could go after these kind of funds. There's a lot we can still continue doing if we wanted to be more aggressive in prosecuting this conflict. But unfortunately, we've been very shy in doing this so far.
And Jeff, how we, either unite or separate the foreign policy towards different countries? Because, we always, at least always in Ukraine and also in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, we look, the US policy towards Russia on what they are doing in this region. And at the same time, there could be some negotiation over Iran or over Syria. So in that regard, how it could be, where to look, what to look at, speaking that, there could be a different story on US-Russia, actions over Syria and something else here.
Well, here's the context in which I would like to see this. Russia has emerged as a pretty effective global troublemaker, okay? Vladimir Putin is an individual who leads a country that has a relatively weak hand, but he plays it very strongly. We argue at times about whether he's a master strategist or a tactical opportunist. The bigger issue is he is a man with a vision. He wants Europe weak and divided. He wants spheres of influence, and he wants to build Russia up by cutting America down. I would like us to have a comparable vision. We want a Europe whole and free. We want a Ukraine that's independent, sovereign, democratic, and chooses its own alliances and associations. And I think we want a global, multifaceted strategy vis-a-vis Russia that exacts a price for every instance where Russia aggresses and pushes back and sets the agenda wherever we can. Ukraine, other areas in Eastern Europe, Syria. You can go through a list of things, but they should feel our agenda pushing at them. We don't wish any ill will toward the Russian people, but we don't want a revanchist Russia. We want a normalized, cooperative Russia. And he doesn't play that game. So I would like to see whatever we do in Syria, and Syria is so important, but in a broader context that pushes Russia aggression back on all fronts and modifies very bad behavior.
And Ben, would you explain to us President Macron's policy in this regard? Really, he supported the strikes. Yet, especially here, we know that there are more or less a good relation with the President Trump, though while there was an election of the French president, there was some kind of idea of not the anonymity, but the fact that Macron presents a different idea, something totally different. He is against populism. He is against what sometimes President Trump represents. So what that could mean for this alliance of France and the United States?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. He was elected on, I would say, almost the opposite platform as Donald Trump. If you say that Donald Trump is in favor of protectionism and closeness, he was in favor of open societies, free market. He's a big supporter of European integration. But at the same time, he is a pragmatic in foreign policy, and he does believe that you need to cooperate with allies, and especially with Donald Trump. And I think the case he's been trying to make to Donald Trump is that the transatlantic alliance is important. You know, Donald Trump is someone who's very critical of Europeans because he believes that Europeans should do more for their own defense and security. You know, he's always talking about burden sharing. And he's not wrong. It is true that Europeans could invest more in their own security and border control. And this is something that the French have long said. The French are very assertive militarily. They have troops in Africa. They're very involved in the coalition against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So this is also something paradoxically on which Trump and Macron can agree, which is that, you know, he does want also Europe to be, Macron wants also Europe to be more autonomous. Now, when it comes to Syria, the French, including with Macron's predecessors, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, had a very tough position on Syria. I think there's no trust between French leaders and Assad. The French have known Assad for a long time, and they know how brutal his repression has been. Europeans have been the first victims of terrorism that spread out of Syria, and that is a direct consequence of the repression of the Assad regime. So I think the French have been especially at the forefront of having a more proactive reaction to the conflict in Syria. And the Red Line incident in 2013 was a big subject of division between the French and Americans, because at the time President Hollande wanted to strike Syrian chemical facilities, and Barack Obama is the one who changed his mind at the last minute. So I think there's always been this strong position that President Macron continued as president, and I think it's very important as a show of transatlantic unity that France, the United Kingdom, and the United States were together in these strikes.
And Jeff, indeed, if we follow with the other countries, so Theresa May had, the United Kingdom supported the strikes as well. Even Germany, which is usually very critical in that regard, wasn't critical. So really, what does it mean, the whole strikes, for the unity of the transatlantic community? And is it like just the one, like one situational unity, or that could also mean for kind of further relations also on the the policy towards Russia, not just on Syria? but
well, it's a good sign. I don't know if it's sustainable. We have a moment now across the West where the watchword is not unity, not internally and not across national boundaries. And in an instance like this, that the UK and France and the United States could cooperate and lead together, I think is extremely important. That Germany, that can be sometimes dovish or reticent about these things, is supportive, is extremely important. And I think we have to be mindful that we do have enemies, adversaries, who are going to see this, and they're going to now work to chip away and weaken and fracture and divide. I mean, Vladimir Putin and others will not stand idly. If we could find this as a moment for Western leadership to remind ourselves that there is a transatlantic community of interests and also values, and we are united by far more than separates us, and put some political energy behind this around other projects too. Maybe Ukraine, for example, and assisting Ukraine. But you know, right now this is a photograph, and we're in a movie, we're in a film, and something came before, and something's going to come after. The photograph we have is very heartening. It's encouraging, but it's a still shot. It's still one photograph, one frame.
And my last question for both of you. You know, we're in the region where people could afford earlier not to care that much what's happening in the Middle East and what are the US-Syria relation. And I'm not speaking just on Ukraine, but the whole region of Eastern Europe. Yet today, still with escalation, there are concerns. You know, that Russia had shown enough of strength and courage to do the things which before were not tolerated, and in the end they were tolerated with annexations, with kind of the things, with actual fighting. So really, do you think, what could be the concerns, you know, realistic concerns on that kind of escalation, and could you put for this region, for audience who is here, this kind of the Middle Eastern escalation and its meaning to this place?
Well, first I would say these are not isolated crises. This is part of a broader pattern of Russian aggression against the European or transatlantic security order that was built after the end of the Cold War. When you look at the behavior in Ukraine, when you look at the behavior, the support for these massacres against civilians in Syria, this is also a consequence of the fact that the United States and Europeans withdrew and they didn't want to push back against this form of Russian aggression and Russian-Iranian in the Middle East. So I think if we start pushing back, if we start increasing the cost for intervention like we haven't done in the last few years, I think it will start sending a signal, including in different places. As I said earlier, I think one of the reasons why Russia felt it could intervene without any pushback in Ukraine in 2014 was because it saw that we didn't follow our own red lines the year before in Syria. And I think now if we show that we're serious and we're ready to confront, we're ready to go after the money that is still hidden in European capitals, that we're ready to confront after assassinations like the one that happened in Salisbury recently, and against these acts in Syria and Ukraine, I think it sends a signal that we're back and we're taking this seriously.
Well, what I appreciate about what Ben just said was he's talking about something that's global and a strategy that's multifaceted and pushing on different points. To your question, Talia, I think we should be very sober. We Europeans, Americans, this is a long game now. Number one, will Russia respond or retaliate? Absolutely. When, where, and what method, we don't know, but Russia will not be idle. Is this a long game in terms of we needing to allocate resources, military and financial and diplomatic, and risk and sacrifice, and endure setbacks? None of this is going to turn around in 2018. There will be no claiming victory in 2019. If we want to reorder this relationship, set the agenda, and put it into Russian revanchism, we're talking about some years, but as Ben suggested, a global approach with a multifaceted strategy.
Yet there is something to add from my side following the conflict in Syria as well, that in the end the situation of the people in Syria isn't getting any better with the whole thing which is happening. So, you know, there was a strike, there was the answer, but indeed it's still the very, very gruesome situation all over the country. Thanks a lot for the discussion. I'm very happy to have you here in Kyiv. So Ben Haddad, who is the Hudson a fellow, and Jeff Gedmin, a fellow from the Georgetown University. Ukraine needs reforms. It's a mantra that both locals and foreigners have been hearing for the past 4 years. While progress had been made in some areas, the government continues to drag its feet on key anti-corruption efforts despite pressure from Western authorities. Melinda Herring, editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog and one of the most knowledgeable analysts on Ukraine, says Ukraine has plenty of potential for turnaround, but the progress on the ground has been disappointing. We have earlier spoke to Herring on how the reforms are seen from Washington and what we should look at before the Ukrainian election cycle starts. Melinda, my first question in general, really, like if to kick off the discussion, with no longer Rex Tillerson in the State Department, what actually going on? How would you describe the Ukrainian-US relations at this moment?
So Rex Tillerson was removed and he's going to be replaced by Mike Pompeo. And there's been a big discussion, how does he feel about Ukraine? How does he feel about Russia? And most of the experts that I've spoken with think that Pompeo is actually a hawk. And that he will be even tougher when it comes to dealing with Russia than Tillerson was. So that's certainly a good thing. And there's other positive signs within the larger administration. So there are people who are fantastic, who understand Ukraine and all the complex dynamics here. Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell is fantastic. There's people in the National Security Council as well who are really tuned into this. So in spite of sort of the headlines and all the concern about Trump, did he get support from the Russians to get elected? Is he soft on Putin? There are signs, there are mixed messages all over the place. There are people who are strong and know what's going on. And these people believe in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to succeed. The U.S. has finally agreed to send javelins here, and they're meant to arrive here this month. The U.S. has finally put real serious sanctions with a lot of bite in place. So I think there's a lot of good things that are happening.
At the same time, as you said, it's always overshadowed by Trump relations to Russia, Mueller's investigation, and the whole talk about the collusion. So at this stage, what do we really know, and how really then, what is the role of the President Trump in that?
I don't think you should focus on Trump. I think you should ignore the tweets. He likes to create fireworks. He's splashy. I think you should focus on policy. I think you should focus on what the U.S. and the West continues to do in Ukraine. And the line hasn't changed. It hasn't fundamentally changed. If anything, it's gotten a little bit tougher.
But recently there was an article on, for instance, Ukrainian oligarch Pinchuk donating the money to the Donald Trump campaign for the fact that he had been giving a speech a couple of years ago at the conference here in Kiev, and later that he donated to Hillary Clinton. How all these things are also seeing, how Ukraine is seeing.
I don't think it's a big piece of it right now. I mean, the focus is really on Russia and Trump and the results of the election. The Pinchuk story is a side story, a speech from New York at the Yes conference. I think it was in 2015. And the question is, was Pinchuk trying to buy influence? Can it be considered a campaign contribution? And that's what's sort of the question. So it's sort of a side story of the Mueller investigation.
We're speaking about the reforms, the anti-corruption fight, and the situation on the front line, all the other things. So in particularly at this stage, how is Ukraine seen in DC?
There are many views on Ukraine in Washington. I would say, number one, it's important to say that there's huge interest in Ukraine on Capitol Hill, in the diaspora, in the think tanks. But in general, my opinion, my expert opinion after following the reforms for the last 3 years, I'm extremely disappointed. It's been 4 years and there's no justice. Ukraine still has not fixed its courts. The heartbreaking part of following Ukraine is that everyone knows what needs to be done, but no one does it. That's the heartbreak. There is talent in this country. There is deep talent in this country. But it can't be realized because for a variety
of...
Well, so there are people who should be in the RADA, right? But there's tremendous talent in this country, people who want to get into political life, and they can't get in because of the electoral system. The electoral law is one of the things that massively needs to be changed this year, and it won't be.
So you said like there is a huge interest. There would be talks that said like there is a Ukrainian fatigue. It definitely exists in Europe, but how is it in the U.S.? And in particularly, you know, you expressed your expert point of view, but in that regard, how serious are those disappointment on the reforms? At the same time, when you listen, you kind of see that still the U.S. is on the Ukrainian on the U.S. On the Ukrainian side. So, in general, to what extent the establishment is critical, and to what extent is still kind of saying that okay, we understand you're at war with Russia. We will keep our eyes closed. We wouldn't discuss that, but we understand.
There's a tension between these two camps. So one is saying you need to push harder on domestic reforms. The other is we don't want to push too hard because you do have this corruption fight. So those are it's sort of like it's a balancing act. I think people though are growing increasingly disappointed with Poroshenko in particular, and we expected a lot more. There were some, I don't want to be totally pessimistic though, there were some reforms last year. There were reforms in health, in education, pension reforms, but these aren't enough. The problem is these aren't enough to get the economy growing. So the economy still stinks, right? The economy should be performing at 6 to 7%. Instead, it's projected to perform at 3.5%. But there's a big catch to this. The World Bank just said it may be more like 2% if Ukraine does not enact some structural reforms. And it's resisting enacting these hard reforms.
So what are these particular, directions where you think the Ukraine is not really fast enough?
We need an anti-corruption court. That's one of the first things that would convince business. It would convince people to take Ukraine seriously as a destination to start investing money. Foreign direct investment has been zero for the last 3 years because no one trusts the courts. No one wants to put money here. If you talk to the business community, it's kind of boring to read their surveys. You know what they're going to say. Corruption remains the top problem. Over and over again. They need to liberalize gas prices and let the prices float up to market level. I understand it's political suicide, but they need to do it. Honestly, if you wanted if you wanted to take Ukraine from its middling growth to 6 to 7, you're going to have to do a lot. You're going to need to finally. So the militia has been disbanded officially, but they still haven't put a fiscal investigative service into place. And there's big fights in the parliament over that right now. Ukraine needs land reform. Right? We know this. There's been 8 or 9 attempts at it in Parliament, and they just pass a moratorium again. I've been here for the last 3 days talking to civil society activists, and this is not a good year, right? In terms of what we can expect. It's the year before the elections. Every decision is being calculated based on how will this look, in an election cycle. So basically, civil society says that if we manage to keep land reform and the electoral reform on the table, like if we manage to keep talking about it, that's a win. I think that's terrible. I think that's absolutely terrible. That we can't have greater expectations because this is a fabulous country, and Ukrainians are fabulous, and there is so much talent in this country that's unrealized, and that's the thing that breaks my heart.
To what extent there is a feeling that the government is in a bit this denial mode? Oh, those Westerners, again, they demand us instead of helping us to a large extent.
I think the only thing that works in Ukraine right now is the sandwich approach. You need to have civil society squeezing the government and the Western donors squeezing on the other side in order to get reforms into place. I don't think this government wants to push any harder on the hard structural reforms, and it's not going to do it without that pressure.
What would you say on these comments which are sometimes here that, how it happened that, Ukraine fights a war, but in the West people hear more about the corruption in Ukraine, how it happens, is it fair, and is it like the West pushing its own agenda? I heard those comments on some of the anti-corruption activists who are so much speaking in the West, on the MPs who are speaking in the West, and they say like how it's come that they are kind of, instead of helping Ukraine, they are more complaining about the things and maybe sometimes in the panic mood.
So what's the alternative? To say that it could be worse? That's not an argument. That's not an argument. It could be worse. I mean, that's not an argument. Our job is to evaluate what Ukraine looks like today with realism, with affection, but with realism. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to call it the way we see it, and we're going to continue to push Ukraine to fulfill its potential.
And what would be the things for you to indicate that things are moving on the wrong direction and on the right direction?
Let's put all the cards on the table. I think things are moving in the wrong direction. I'm worried about the short and medium term picture here. I'm very worried about the economy. I'm worried about the elections. In particular, I've been snooping around for the past 3 days, and I keep counting and learning about new political parties that want to vie for the reform vote, right? The reform vote in this country is not the Euromaidan vote, however you want to call it, is not huge. It's maybe 25 to 30, 35%. And there's, a lot of people want that vote. And there's no unity right now. So that's one thing that I'm worried about. I'm worried about the rise of populism. That's going to be a big part of the elections. I'm worried about Russian interference in the elections, in the Ukrainian elections. That's a real possibility.
And what do you think are the things which will indicate for you that things are moving in the right direction?
We want to see movement on that before the elections. We want to see movement on electoral reform. I think those would be, and the fiscal investigative services would be another big thing to watch. If you look at IMF conditionality, the thing that they're not going to compromise on is the anti-corruption court. And I think Bankova thinks that it can kind of do one of these and maybe change the conditions or get around this by playing with some of the language. Ukraine is going to need some cash later on this year. And it's going to need IMF conditionality. They're not going to be able to just float another Eurobond like they did last year.
The full version of our reports and interviews are on our webpage. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign up box is on the upper right hand side of the site. Also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International, and we will be back in a second. The support of the West highly depends on Ukraine's success in fighting corruption and nepotism, which are considered to be its greatest burden. So what are the best practices for fighting corruption in Eastern Europe? We've asked that the head of the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption, Alina Mungiu-Pipidi, an outstanding Romanian political academic and one of the key civil society activists in the region.
Can you name specific indicators of these effective reforms? What are they?
Well, I do not know indicators of effective reform in Ukraine. The only one which really impressed me, and I think that the others which should be like this, were the fact that, for instance, you had an energy market, which was a reflection of what we call privileged economy, an economy where bad restrictive regulation actually creates winners, people who get economic rents and do not get rich by merit. And this market was dominated by a very few selected, connected companies, which got a lot of money out of this, just because they had the privilege of being in this market and other people were denied this privilege. And the fact that this small, limited number of companies now has grown to quite a significant number of companies who are able to trade energy shows that the market access has opened. This is how it should be.
Despite starting with very harsh reforms, such as lustration in Ukraine, we're now facing the situation when the reforms are mostly pushed by the civil society groups rather than the government. Do you think it suffices?
I am not aware of any country to have succeeded in radically changing a governance regime, for instance, from systematically corrupt to exceptionally corrupt, except if some enlightened elite comes to government, either in the form of one party or in the form of more parties, a coalition of parties, broadly supported from society, supported by businesses who want competitive business environment and not a privileged business environment, supported by universities, by intellectuals, and supported by a broader group of people. So I think it is absolutely heroic to fight from civil society to change a country, but unless you have broader civil society and its political representation, a coalition of parties which managed to get 51% in parliament and pass the necessary reforms, because in countries such as Ukraine, corruption is not an isolated phenomenon. You cannot cure corruption in health or in education without radically reforming the system of health of education. A part of a corruption is policy failure. It's produced by bad policies in the way that the systems are organized. And it's not going to disappear, you know, just by arresting doctors who receive gifts. You really need to change the system. And for this, you need to have a majority in parliament. You also need to know what to do, but you also need to win some elections. And this might take some time, but there is no avoidance of that. That is the way ahead.
There is now a visual battle between anti-corruption activists and the government. Even the anti-corruption activists are being made to declare their assets publicly now in Ukraine. Have you ever seen such a situation in any other country? And what do you think is the most effective way of communication between these two groups?
Well, first, I think this situation is really ridiculous. I haven't heard of any other country in which anti-corruption activists, and by the way, an anti-corruption activist doesn't have to be a salaried anti-corruption activist. It can be a journalist, right? Investigative journalist or somebody who writes in a column regularly, and you really cannot go around and ask all these people who are completely private individuals to declare their fortunes. The reason why we are asking for financial disclosures from officials is because officials in their official capacity, they have the opportunity to trespass between public authority and private profit. And this is why they have to declare their fortune. This opportunity doesn't exist for journalists. Journalists don't have any power and access to public purse, and it doesn't exist for civil society activists. So this whole thing looks a little bit like a revenge to me and the form of harassment to civil society. On the other hand, I think that also it might be that civil society in Ukraine conceives very narrowly anti-corruption as just real-time repression of these top people who might do something that civil society think that this is wrong. And I know this is very tempting, you know, I'm Romanian by birth, and in my native country, a lot of ministers have been put to jail, and even, you know, former prime minister and former president are in danger. But corruption has not gotten better due to all this. And it has not gotten better because civil society and politicians have never really worked together to enact the necessary reforms for corruption not to be produced anymore. You know, I can put a minister in jail today, but if it's very lucrative business, the minister who would come tomorrow would just take over the rent and do all over the same again. So you have to have some cooperation with politicians. And for this cooperation with politicians who have the advantage of being elected, you know, maybe they're bad politicians, maybe they're corrupt politicians. God knows that in many of these countries they tend to be corrupt politicians. Nevertheless, you have to meet in between, at least for them to enact these preventive reforms. Sometimes they may do them because, you know, they might feel less threatened by this kind of reforms, by deregulation, by privatization, and this really are by demonopolization. Really, these are the reforms which change a country, not just arresting people. Because how many people can you arrest? You know, in Romania, there's no sufficient room in prisons. At a certain point, there were really jokes that in the preventive arrest of the Bucharest police, since most of the people, you know, important people tend to be in the capital, there was no room, you know, they were putting 6 or 8 people in one room to sleep. But in the end of the day, this didn't really, you know, change much, change less than in other countries where you managed to negotiate some reforms. So unfortunately, you have to have a little bit of diplomacy of anti-corruption, and that would mean, however, that, you know, people step a little bit back. They do not repress their own anti-corruption society, civil society, but also that anti-corruption civil society understands a little bit more comprehensively this anti-corruption, not just repression of people who are there in power.
What are the lessons for Ukraine to be learned within the example of the Eastern European countries, which have been a successful case for combating corruption?
Well, I think Ukraine was very close this time around from learning these lessons. I think Ukraine was very slow in learning these lessons because the successful East European examples, which are in particular Estonia, have been around for quite a while. And if Ukrainian rulers would have wanted to do what Estonia had done, they had ample opportunity, right? But they didn't dare do it. Nevertheless, that example is still there, and meanwhile there is the most recent example of Georgia, and I know that Ukraine tried to learn from Georgia, but I think that Ukraine actually should do more, and in particular should do more in terms of the Georgian administrative revolution, of administrative simplification, of transparency. I think that there's quite a lot of lessons that Ukraine can still do. There are very close examples which can be culturally transferred. It's not easy, to do what whoever else did, but doing what is best in East European countries is really something which is, I think, accessible to Ukraine, and I would insist in this.
At least 43 foreign observers invited by Russia's parliament were present on the occupied peninsula as Crimea went to Russia presidential elections, which are held illegally since this Ukrainian territory is annexed. The reputable bodies, such as OSCE, did not send their monitors, while in a bid to validate the elections, Russia brought over its own international monitors to the peninsula, many with the ties to the Kremlin. Political analyst and the author of Russia and the Western Far Right, Anton Shekhovtsov, identified dozens of so-called observers, including Western journalists and youth groups affiliated with European parties. We spoke to Anton Shekhovtsov about the Europeans who traveled to Russia-occupied Crimea and their connection to the Kremlin. Watch our interview.
Let me tell you that, first of all, in comparison to the so-called referendum in Crimea on the 16th of March 2014, the political representation this time, in March this year, was much lower. So, in my opinion, as far as I understand, the Russian authorities or the Crimean authorities, they failed to mobilize many of the people they would like to mobilize and invite them to Crimea. If, for example, 4 years ago, there were more than 40 politicians, acting politicians, present as so-called observers of the referendum, now I counted only maybe around 20 of people were actual politicians. And some of the names that are already familiar to us were Johan Beckman, an activist, a pro-Kremlin activist from Finland, who brought an entire delegation from Finland together with him. But he was the only official observer at the election. Then Andreas Maurer, who is a politician from Germany. He's a regional politician representing the left-wing party or far left party in Germany, Die Linke. And again, going back to the referendum in 2014, there were at least 3 people from Die Linke present in Crimea at the referendum. But now it was only 1, and it was from a regional council. Then there was a representative of a far-right party, of a German far-right party called Alternative for Germany. He was also observing this election. Another person who is already known to us, to the experts who are dealing with the Russian influence, is Sereda Trifkovic. She's an activist. She's not a politician, but she's an activist, pro-Kremlin activist from Serbia. And talking in general about the political representation, I would also mention the Cypriot left-wing party. They sent 2 or 3 people to Crimea. Then some left-wing party from Venezuela. There were also people from the centrist parties or center-left parties and the center-right parties from France. There was nobody from the Front National, from the National Front, from the far-right party, although one could expect someone to come to Crimea because the National Front is a very much pro-Kremlin party, but there was nobody. As far as I know, there was nobody present in Crimea, although some of the National Front activists and politicians went to Russia to observe the election. The Kremlin, if we by the Kremlin mean at least the State Douma or the Federation Council, they simply send invitations to people. But those people, those politicians who eventually would go to Crimea, they were previously in contact with some other organizations which are not necessarily linked to the Kremlin directly. So there are gongos, which is a word for government-organized, non-government organizations, essentially very pro-Kremlin organizations, but not necessarily connected to the Kremlin, which do this business in terms of finding individual observers. And they send them invitations first, which are being followed by the official invitations from the State Douma or the Federation Council.
And we are in particular interested in two people. For example, the first is the former election monitor member of OSCE mission, and he had links to Kremlin, and he has been monitoring elections in Ukraine as well. And also you mentioned in your report a Ukrainian woman. So what can you say about these people? What were their role?
Well, there was a woman, Tatiana Mele, who was referred to as a Ukrainian citizen, or as an observer from Ukraine. However, if you look at her social profiles, you will find out that she no longer lives in Ukraine. She lived in St. Petersburg. She doesn't call herself Tetiana, she calls herself Tatiana, so in Russian spelling. And I also have a suspicion that now she doesn't even live in Russia. So I think she lives in Germany or in some Western European country. So it was she was referred to as an observer from Ukraine just for propaganda purposes by the Russian media, to show that there are some people in Ukraine who, say, are interested in what is going on in Russia, in Crimea, but at the same time they would justify the annexation of Crimea. And as for the person who, I don't remember his name now, the person who previously went to, or was a participant of one of the OSCE missions, I don't think that it is, like, his previous involvement with the OSCE tells us anything about his position at the moment. But this is how he got in touch, or he was introduced to a Russian citizen who was working for the Civic Control Association that I mentioned. So he invited that foreign observer to Crimea. So this is just how they got in touch in the first place a couple of years ago.
And what can you say? What goals did the Kremlin had by inviting these monitors? Why did they need them?
Essentially, they needed those foreign observers who would go to Crimea just basically for propaganda purposes to try to legitimize the annexation of Crimea in the domestic and international, for the domestic and international audience. Probably mostly for the domestic audience, because, you know, they invited foreign observers to Russia. And in March 2018, so this year, the number of the foreign observers who went to Russia was the highest in comparison to any other electoral processes in Russia. So they really wanted to show that foreign observers would go to Russia and say that the elections were fine. But since there was no organization, no established organization wanted to send any observers to Crimea, they still needed to have foreign observers in Crimea to show that Crimea is not different from any other region of Russia.
Within 4 years of war in eastern Ukraine, the region has rapidly become one of the most mined areas in the world, according to the UN. The mined territory of 7,000 square meters poses a threat for the locals, mainly those along these 450 kilometers, which is pretty lengthy. Experts say that demining may take up to 40 years to complete. The Hromadske team had traveled to the frontline village in the Donetsk region, close to Debaltseve, where one of the biggest battles of 2015 took place, to see how it affects the locals and how demining is being carried out.
The dry grass crunches under our feet. We're at a field near the Novoluhansk village in Donbas. In winter 2015, Ukrainian soldiers passed through Novoluhansk when they left Debaltseve. Before war, the area of dozens of hectares was used by a local agricultural farm that breeds pigs. Now, deminers are working at the scene. It's best for the locals not to go to this field. We spend a couple of hours with the deminers. We mostly encounter scrap, and then suddenly, the search device beeps, which indicates that this spot can potentially have missiles. The soil needs to be removed with care while being regularly checked with a detector.
Металлические изделия, которые являются продуктами человека. На боеприпасы. Нет, никаких боеприпасов сегодня. Да, конечно, рабочего дня. Он 35-й подъезжает.
Novoluhansk has never been under separatist control, but after Ukrainian soldiers returned from Debaltseve and up until December 2016, it was de facto part of the so-called grey zone. During the fighting in Svetlodarska Duha, the Ukrainian soldiers took the settlement under their control. But despite this, the outskirts of the settlement are constantly shelled. Novoluhansk residents say that before the war they also had some allotments where they grew vegetables.
In spring, we still grew vegetables despite the shellings. What else could we do? We want to live, so we need to plant some potatoes and onions.
The local government reassures that they regularly inform the residents on what to do if they encounter explosives.
We have posters everywhere providing instructions about explosive objects. They clearly explain what to do if you come across an unidentified object. There are also talks with teachers at school. The police and soldiers carry them out. So all this work is done with the population.
The residents say that they learned all the rules on how to behave around explosives themselves.
I don't think anyone would hang out in the places where there are signs that say danger or mines. I think people go over there in the direction of the cottage houses where there are fields. But regarding the settlement itself, what can I say? The children want to play. They want to go outside. Life goes on. So yes, people hang out here. But of course, the rest of the territories are out of bounds. They're all being monitored, I think.
And now we're in the city of Kramatorsk. This is the office of the Halo Trust. Together with the Ukrainian State Emergency Service, this international organization works on demining Donbas. According to their data, since the beginning of the war, 1,826 soldiers and civilians suffered from explosions. According to the experts' preliminary estimates, there are 700,000 hectares of territory that will need to be demined. The assistant of the Halo Trust in Ukraine shows us the missiles found by the deminers in the Donbas.
We've encountered some OZM mines, MON mines. Well, TM62, that's a very common one. We saw many of them in Novoluhansk, and we still do. Some hand grenades over here. These are F1 grenades. So the first stage is called fast estimation. That means fast and short visits to every area that was subject to conflict. And gathering quick information whether there are any mines or any unexploded ordnance. Then we draw one map for all these territories, and every town or village receives its status, either dangerous or potentially safe. Using results from our non-technical examination, we then send our deminer groups to war-torn areas. Depending on the danger level of the area, we choose one or another method of work, and then finally we clear the areas.
The organization hopes that after demining, they will be able to return the demined areas back to the people, but at the moment this procedure is not made possible by the Ukrainian law.
We are looking at a relevant experience of our neighbors. After Russian-Georgian war in 2008, more than a dozen villages in Shida-Kartli region needed to be demined. International mine clearing organization Howell Trust has been undertaking operation there for a decade now. More than 3,600 munitions have been destroyed during this time. The organization hopes to finish its demining operation within the next year. This is a story from our partners GEM News.
აი ესე ვხედავდით სულ ამ მაღლა ვიცირებოდით როგორ იბომბებოდა სოფელი. შიგსახში ჩამოვარდა, როგორ ჩამოვარდა ვერ გავიგება რა. იქ წინა ეზოში რო ჩამოვარდა, ისა დავინახე. დალიწე ეტყობა ყველაფერი, რატოც ფანჯარა არ არის, მთელი შუშა სუძირს ეყარა, აღარაფერი აღარ იყო და თავში ვირტყამდი ვაიმე მეთქი, ჩემი გაჭირებით გაკეთებული სახლი, კარი. მე რო შევედი უკვე მოვათვარიელე ყველაფერი და კრიშა ჩამოგლეჯილი იყო. პოლში იყო ჩავარდნილი დიდი ორმო იყო ესე გაკეთებული ამ პოლში. ეხლა მე უცხოელები მოვიდნენ, რამდენჯერმე პოლი აგვაყრეინეს თვითონვე რა, თვითონვე მუშაობდნენ. ამ ოთხარეს ჩავიდნენ სიღრმეში, მაგრამ ვერაპოულობდნენ ამ იმას არა და მთლიანად მორღვეული იყო ეს ადგილი, სასაც ჩავარდა. თაგვმა რო გადაირბინოს შეიძლება ის აფეთქდეთ ღამეო. და მე რავი ერთმა მადლიანმა ადამიანმა გარისკა და ამოიღო და იქვე ახლოს იმაში რა მიწები ჩაყარის მეშოკებში რაღაცები შემოუღობეს და იქ ააფეთქეს ის. ორ ნაწილად ააფეთქეს, ორი ნაწილი იყო.
დილით 7 საათი იყო, აღარ მახსოვს ზუსტად. გამოვედი პირის დასაბანად და დაიწყო კიდევაც ჩამოცვიდა და ნუ ვეღარ მოვასწარე, შიგნით შესულდა ეგ სახლის წინ ჩამოვარდა და დავიჭერე. ორივე ფეხში მქონდა მოხვედრილი, ორივე ხელში მქონდა მოხვედრილი და ბარკალზეც აქ ფეხზეც აქ მქონდა. სულ 16 ასკოლკა მომკვდა. დაახლოებით 160 კასეტური ბომბის ნარჩენი ამოღებული იყო აი ამ ტერიტორიიდან. 1 ჰექტარის ოდენობით არის. წლის 15 მარტს საგასაფულო სამუშაოებს ვატარებდი, ბაღს ხვნავდი და საუკე თითქმის ურჩებოდი ბაღის მოხვნას, ერთ ადგილზე მოხდა აფეთქება. აფეთქება მოხდა და მე გადმომაგდო ტრაქტორმა. წამოვხვდი, ჩავაქერი ტრაქტორი და 1-5 წუთი შეიძლება უფრო მეტი მე ვიგორავი ტკივილები დამეწყო, მაგრამ 2 ასკოლკა თავში მომხდა, 8 ბეჭებში და 3 კლავში. და ეხლა ამჟამად ყველა ასკოლკა ორგანიზმშია გაჩერებული და კაფსულები გაკეთდა რა ასკოლკების. მითხრეს რომ ამოვიღოთ უფრო დავაზიანებთ და ჯობია დავტოვოთ. ჩემი აფეთქებიდან ერთი კვირა თუ 10 დღეში 10 დღის შემდეგ დაიწყეს გაწმენდა და ერთი კვირა მოუნდა. მის შემდეგ მე 2 ლიმოკა იპოვეს კიდე. ერგედეს ერგედები.
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. And go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua where you can find full version of our interviews and reports. There also you can sign up for our brand new newsletter. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We are there for you 24/7 and goodbye.